Louise Coste, morte pour la France. Marie-Louise Manderini, morte pour la France. Agnès Di Pietro, morte pour la France. Janine Fabregon, morte pour la France. Alberte Génin, morte pour la France. Paulette Morisi, morte pour la France. Marguerite Roux, morte pour la France. Aline Sicard, morte pour la France. Anne-Marie Loud, morte pour la France. André Arnaud, morte pour la France. Jeanne Avril, morte pour la France. Charlotte Honick, morte pour la France. Antoinette Degas, morte pour la France. André Bolotel, morte pour la France. Marinette Benabide, morte pour la France.
War isn't just a man's game. When a war's over, though, men always tend to forget the essential part that women have played in it. At the end of the Second World War, the thousands of women who had resisted the enemy kept quiet about it. They went home to their families with all the modesty acquired over centuries of male domination. Only 10% of the medals for resistance went to women. In 1945, 1,030 men were made companions of the liberation, and only 6 women. Women may well have, for the first time ever, been able to join the French army, a revolutionary idea in itself. But at the victory processions, they were all taken for English or Americans. So unthinkable for the French was the idea of a female soldier. Before long, the most enduring images of the conflict would be those of women with their heads shaved for being collaborationists, the ideal scapegoats for a country that had just stared into the abyss. Women were the eternal victims of war, forever the forgotten ones of history, as if all their suffering and heroism were simply absorbed into that of their menfolk. But those women too were at war, and to hear their story is to look war right in the face. In 1939, France's 21.4 million women still didn't have the right to vote. Despite their crucial contribution to the First World War, women in France, both politically and socially, were treated as lifelong minors. French women didn't even have rights over their own bodies, and all methods of contraception were forbidden. But more and more of them were daring to stand up against the inequalities that women were victim to, and above all, against the greatest injustice. A woman's right to vote became an important popular cause in the 1930s. Berthe Wilde was one of the militants fighting for women's rights. She was an upper-middle-class child of a Protestant family from the south of France. Everyone called her Bertie. In the 1920s, with her Dutch banker husband, she went to live in London. There, Madame Bertie Albrecht, as she now was introduced to militant feminism by English activists. Back in Paris, and by then separated from Frédéric Albrecht, free at last of a husband who forbade her any political involvements, Bertie could be as militant as she liked. To gain her independence, she did what was unthinkable at the time for a woman of her class. She got a job. She went into the factories as a personnel manager, in charge of those female workers who most needed her help. In her struggle for a woman's right to choose her own destiny, she soon found a surprising and amorous ally in the person of a young officer in the colonial infantry, a right-wing nationalist son of the ultra-Catholic bourgeoisie of Lyon, by the name of Henri Freinet. Nothing that happened thereafter could have taken place without Bertie, Henri would later say. Lucie Bernard came from a very modest background, and through hard work and sacrifice had completed her studies with great distinction. As a young history professor and member of the Communist Party, in the 1930s, as Adolf Hitler was rising to power in Germany, she trained as both a militant and a combatant. She knew how to floor a far-right agitator with a punch in the streets of the Latin Quarter. But it was in Strasbourg that she met her alter ego. Raymond Samuel, a young civil engineer, had also learned his lessons well at the Communist Party's Workers' University. Lucie and Raymond Aubrac, the nom de guerre by which they would soon be known by the whole of France, promised never to part. When France and Great Britain, as allies of Poland, declared war on Germany, Raymond, along with 4.5 million men under the age of 49, was immediately mobilized. Lucie and all the women of France felt the pain of separation from their menfolk. It was the first of the sufferings the women would endure and the harbinger of many more to come. Paris, as the 1940s dawned, was living through strange days indeed. The country was at war, but there was no fighting. It was a virtual war with no visible enemy, and the French believed they were safe behind the Maginot Line of fortifications set up to defend the country's eastern flank. The French government, by now in total disarray, chose to begin by attacking the so-called enemy within, the communists. For Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin had set the cat among the pigeons by signing a non-aggression pact with Germany and allying himself to Hitler to occupy a part of Poland. The young Mai Politzer was dumbfounded by the Soviets' decision. It seemed to her that in a matter of days they had done a complete U-turn. Some years earlier, Mai had won the heart of the brilliant philosopher Georges Politzer, whose politics she had long admired. Mai had become an active militant in the Union of the Young Girls of France, the organization run by her great friend Danielle Casanova. Danielle Casanova and her comrades, all militant pacifists and anti-fascists, had launched a feminist newspaper called Jeunes Filles de France, or Young Girls of France. Danielle and Mai's paper, though, was banned by the government, along with L'Humanité and dozens of other communist publications. In early 1940, repression of the French Communist Party was heavy indeed. 35 members of parliament were imprisoned. 2,778 elected communists were stripped of their mandate, and 3,400 militants were arrested. They didn't know it yet, but the two women were about to embark upon their own season in hell. It was to a troubled and divided Paris that Virginia Hall arrived in 1940. Virginia, a young American of 34, was a brilliant secretary at the US State Department who had dreamed of becoming a diplomat. But a simple hunting accident resulting in the loss of her left leg was all it had taken to put paid to that dream. Stung by this and in need of adventure, Virginia resigned her post and came to Paris to enroll in the coming war against Germany. She wanted to make herself useful. She knew that the only branch of the military that recruited women volunteers was the Army Medical Corps. This time, her handicap, her prosthetic leg, was no obstacle. Virginia had no medical training, but she did have a driving license. So the French Army took Virginia Hall on as an ambulance driver and sent her to the east, to the forts along the Maginot Line. When she arrived near the city of Metz, she found idle French troops waiting, arms at the ready for a German attack, with no idea when it would come. But on the 10th of May, 1940, this so-called phony war suddenly and brutally turned into a Blitzkrieg. The German army launched a vast offensive right across Belgium. German panzer divisions rapidly invaded the northeast of France, catching the French military completely by surprise, and within weeks were threatening Paris. Virginia Hall was attached to the 9th Artillery Regiment and witnessed, near Metz, the first weeks of combat. She was constantly transporting the wounded to hospitals. In the brutal and murderous rout, 92,000 French soldiers were killed. Like these people, desperately throwing themselves into the ditches, Virginia too had to abandon her ambulance when the German Stukas strafed everyone, women and children included, with their burning lead. I just cannot understand how people's lives can now be under constant threat from others. I will never understand it, and I think it is terrible. Do not tell me it is in the name of the fatherland. These words were written at the beginning of the war by a young German girl of 18. Sophie Scholl lived with her brothers and sisters in the city of Ulm and was longing to train as a teacher. Sophie, like her brother Hans, was enthused by the values promoted by Adolf Hitler during his rise to power, those of country, comradeship, and community, and of bread and work for every German. For the first time, an organization was offering young girls the opportunity to play sports or to travel without their parents, meet other young people, and build a community. They'd be part of a great cause, they were told. The two teenagers wouldn't listen to the warnings from their father, who compared Hitler to the Pied Piper, that vengeful figure who charmed the children with his flute, only to lead them to their deaths. Unlike their father, the Scholl children thought it all looked perfect. If it wasn't for this Jewish question that kept coming up. The fact was that for Hitler, community meant above all an ethnic community, one that had to be protected from racial degeneration. According to the Nazis, the whole nation was under threat from inferior minorities, the Jews, whom they accused of both everything and nothing, of being both capitalists and Bolshevik Marxists, as well as the Gypsies, the blacks, and the Slavs. Only the mothers of the people, the purebred Germans, should be allowed to procreate and to help populate the fatherland. Yet, while it was the duty of those mothers of the people to breed, another category of women should be prevented from having children. Endless propaganda films set out to convince the German people that radical measures had to be taken to halt the degeneration of the German race. To prevent mixed breeding, mental illness, and hereditary diseases, and to halt the propagation of inferior people, a vast sterilization plan was instigated to protect Germany from those whose lives were considered worthless. 400,000 people were sterilized, 200,000 of them women. Beginning in 1939, 200,000 old people, the sick, the handicapped, or mental patients, were put to death, considered incurable. In the hearts of Sophie and Hans Scholl, that little spark of doubt gradually grew into a flame of indignation and revolt. Their defiance of the Nazis had only just begun. On the 10th of June, Paris was massively bombarded. On the 14th of June, it was declared an open city. The government, which had withdrawn to Tours, now headed further south to Bordeaux. On the 17th of June, Marshal Pétain, who during the night had been appointed Prime Minister, addressed the nation on the radio.
Français, je fais à la France le don de ma personne pour atténuer son malheur. C'est le cœur serré que je vous dis aujourd'hui qu'il faut cesser le combat. Je me suis adressé cette nuit à l'adversaire pour lui demander s'il est prêt à rechercher avec moi, entre soldats, après la lutte et dans l'honneur, les moyens de mettre un terme aux hostilités.
Pétain's talk of an armistice came as a massive blow. At Pimpon, a little village in Brittany, Geneviève de Gaulle, who lived there with her parents, was devastated by the new leader's speech. To her mind, to accept Pétain's proposals was unthinkable. She was not even 20 years old, but she already felt like she'd been branded with a hot iron. What Geneviève didn't know yet, on that 17th of June, was that her uncle, Charles de Gaulle, a young general and a member since the 5th of June of former Prime Minister Paul Reynaud's government, had left Bordeaux when the government resigned and secretly fled to England. He was a general with no troops, but from London he would launch like a message in a bottle an appeal to the French to resist. And though at first hardly anyone heard it, its echo was to resound throughout the whole of France. Raymond, like hundreds of thousands of others, was now a prisoner of the Germans. When his battalion was captured, though, he'd been able to drop a folded slip of paper into the nearest ditch to let Lucie know he'd been taken prisoner. Like many other such notes, it would be passed on by anonymous hands till it reached its destination. Lucie knew what she was doing. In her younger days as a militant, she'd learnt all about undercover tactics with the communist Joseph Epstein. She was aware of the basic rule: the best way to conceal yourself is right out in the open. Straight away, she came up with a plan. She'd get her husband out at any price. The idea was to slip Raymond a drug that would make him so unwell he'd be transferred to a hospital. Raymond had to hide in the garden and climb the fence, in full view of the German guards who could shoot him down easily. He'd never been so scared in his life. But he made it over the fence, and there was Lucie, calmly waiting for him outside in the street. Lucie and Raymond Aubrac were becoming the stuff of legends. German troops were marching through Paris. The new Prime Minister, Marshal Pétain, had agreed to split the country into two zones, divided by a demarcation line almost 1,000 kilometers long. To the west, along the coast, and to the north, lay the occupied zone under German administration. To the south, the so-called Free Zone, under French administration, but paying heavy tributes to Germany on a daily basis. The French government was installed at Vichy. The Republic was no more, and the French state was now promoting work, the family, and the nation as the core values of its politics. And now women were suddenly, it seemed, contributing to the downfall of the nation. For the supporters of Vichy, women had failed in their moral duty, especially those frivolous ones who painted their faces and abandoned their families to go out and work. From now on, with this government, women were no longer individuals with rights of their own. A woman's identity was reduced to that of mother and housewife. The confused young women of France had to be brought back to the righteous path. This was now the French state's mission.
Mère de famille française, votre tâche est la plus rude, elle est aussi la plus belle. Vous êtes avant l'État, les dispensatrices de l'éducation. Vous seuls savez donner à tous ce goût du travail, ce sens de la discipline, de la modestie, du respect qui fait les hommes saints et les peuples forts. Vous êtes les inspiratrices de notre civilisation chrétienne.
Ces jeunes filles ne sont pas des cousettes. Elles travaillent afin de devenir de parfaites femmes d'intérieur. Réparer une prise électrique ou trouver rapidement son chemin ne doit pas les embarrasser. Bien entendu, tâche primordiale, la préparation d'un repas.
2, 3, 4, 5.
Travail, famille, patrie. Work, family, nation. That was the new trinity that replaced the Republican motto, and its first victims were French women. Work. But for whom? The new law of the 11th of October 1940 made it illegal to employ a married woman in the public services. Any of them already married and working could be sacked. If they were over 50, they were forced to retire. Family. But at what price? Divorce was now forbidden during the first 3 years of marriage. Any woman who abandoned the family home was severely punished. Abortion became a crime against the security of the state. Families were torn apart by the men's absence. 1.5 million soldiers were prisoners of the Germans and would remain so throughout the war, destroying the hopes of the women who had thought they'd be home with the Armistice. And nation. But not for everyone. It wasn't a good idea to be foreign or different in Vichy, France. From autumn 1940, there were several texts circulating that didn't hesitate to situate this national revolution as in the direct line of racial segregation as practiced by the Nazi regime. On the 3rd of October, the Vichy government, on its own initiative, published a statute on Jews to be enforced throughout the whole country. Here at the end of 1940, the British capital too was living a nightmare. London was subjected to a constant hail of bombs that Hitler called the Blitz. Every night, waves of between 150 and 200 German planes dropped thousands of bombs on all of England's major cities. This was the London in daily chaos that Virginia Hall, the American ambulance driver, arrived in. Thanks to her American passport, Virginia had managed to get out of France after the Armistice. She headed for Madrid, then Portugal, and finally Great Britain, which was trying to repel the German Armada. The land of Winston Churchill was bending, but not breaking. The Blitz mobilized the whole country, and especially the women of Britain. In contrast to Vichy, France, here the whole country supported women being sent to the front line. In the countryside, women took in children evacuated from the cities to escape the Luftwaffe's intensive bombing. What was urgently needed was a women's land army, soon to be known as the Land Girls, that could work in the fields, replacing the missing men. Even in the British Army itself, women pitched in, driving ambulances, piloting planes, and working in vehicle maintenance. Female workers kept the factories running night and day. There were women in the Home Guard, protecting the civilian population, and in the aerial reconnaissance units, and even in the coastal defense batteries. Just like back in 1914, the women of Britain quickly became an essential part of their country's war effort. Virginia Hall wanted to keep fighting, Very quickly, her passionate personality, her knowledge of the terrain, and her eagerness to serve caught the eye of British intelligence. And in particular, of the SOE, the Special Operations Executive, a clandestine branch of the British services created by Winston Churchill himself. Churchill had given the heads of the SOE just one order: set Europe ablaze. By any means possible, including spreading sabotage and subversion throughout all Nazi-occupied territories. Virginia Hall applied to return to France and was the SOE's young recruit of choice for F Section, its French operation. This was the first time that a secret service had ever recruited and deployed women in field operations. Nearly 40 of them, the best female agents in F Section, would be parachuted into France. The majority of them would pay the ultimate price in what was to be one of British intelligence's most painful failures. Paris, meanwhile, had been overwhelmed by events, and daily life was dominated by the occupying army, whose swastika now hung in front of the Parliament building. Life was getting very difficult for the French, especially for the women, and for the mothers who were having to face it all on their own. Rationing was the rule throughout the country, and the coupons that determined how much food each person could have just weren't enough. Mothers often had to go hungry in order to feed their children or elderly parents. There wasn't enough coal to keep warm, enough leather or textiles or petrol. The first 2 winters of the occupation were particularly tough. Bertie Albrecht, the militant feminist who'd spent the last few years looking after factory workers, urged the Vichy government to appoint her regional inspector for unemployment at Lyon. She started besieging the authorities to get more workspaces established for women and setting up refuges for hundreds of others. She complained to her Vichy superiors that they were only letting her open hospices for the women who couldn't cope anymore. Bertie, the seasoned political agitator, could tell that Vichy, in the streets, in the empty shops, was losing the support of the French people.
Français, j'ai des choses graves à vous dire. De plusieurs régions de France, je sens se lever depuis quelques semaines un vent mauvais. L'inquiétude gagne les esprits. Le doute s'empare des âmes. L'autorité de mon gouvernement est discutée. Les ordres sont souvent mal exécutés. Dans une atmosphère de faux bruit et d'intrigue, les forces de redressement se découragent. Un véritable malaise atteint le peuple français.
This was a big worry for Pétain. The word from the grassroots was that opposition to Vichy was growing, especially among the women. So what did resistance actually mean in the France of 1941, occupied to the north and to the south under the thumb of Pétain? You're not born a member of the Résistance. People just started sharing their general anger about the occupation, about Vichy, in a common cause. 2 people, then 10, then 100. In Lyon, Bertie met up again with Henri Freinet, who had escaped from a prison camp and gone underground. In just a few months, the couple created a vast intelligence and propaganda network, which they called Combat, that aimed to fight the German occupation. And 1941 was the year everything changed for Lucien Raymond Aubrac. Along with Jean Cavaillès and Emmanuel Dastier, they founded the Libération movement. Their aim was to fight against the Nazi occupation however they could, but also against the Vichy regime by distributing a counter-propaganda paper called Libération with a print run of 10,000. Back in the autumn of 1940, Mai and Georges Politzer, along with Hélène and Jacques Solomon and Jacques Decour, had founded a communist students' resistance league, the Free University. Mai devoted all her time to the Free University. She and Danielle Casanova published the movement's newspaper, L'Université Libre. These women of the resistance, like thousands of others, would risk their lives for the cause. They'd quickly become essential, and without them, there'd have been no internal resistance. They took in undercover operatives, hid escaping soldiers, passed on mail, gathered intelligence, typed out and distributed underground newspapers. It was the women of the resistance who kept its networks up and running. In the spring of '41, major events were underway that would change the course of the war. In June, in a fever of expansionism, Adolf Hitler would launch Operation Barbarossa and attack the USSR and Stalin. The Führer's aim was to conquer the fabled German Lebensraum, or living space, that his country had always coveted to the east, and that would feed Germany and guarantee its dominion over the continent of Europe, from Austria to the Balkans, by way of Poland and Ukraine. Hitler's orders were to ethnically cleanse that Lebensraum, in other words, to eliminate the inferior populations, by which the Nazis meant the Jews and the Gypsies. The work of systematically exterminating Jews in the occupied territories fell to the Einsatzgruppen, Nazi death squads supplemented by local militias recruited for their anti-Semitism, and whose ferocity frightened even the German killers themselves. Of this massacre of almost 1.5 million people, men, women, and children, there are only very few traces left. Such as these photographs of the mass killings at Mizoch in Ukraine, at Lipaja in Latvia, or at Kalevi-Liva in Estonia. Starting in early 1942, a system of extermination on an industrial scale was established in order to carry out, according to Adolf Hitler's wishes, the final solution to the Jewish question. The concentration camps of Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and Sobibor now became extermination camps, with gas chambers installed for the mass slaughter of people brought in on trains from all over the Nazi-occupied territories. When they stepped off the trains, some of the men were taken off for forced labor, while the women, along with their children, were sent straight to the gas chambers. To be a mother and able to bear children was an immediate death sentence. It was a crime unparalleled in human history, and it would lead to the death of nearly 6 million of Europe's Jews. Early 1942 proved deadly to many of the resistance in the French-occupied zone. The Germans had grown obsessed with putting an end to organized resistance, and especially to the young communist militants who'd taken up arms and were carrying out many sabotage attacks. They had to be made an example of with harsh sentences to deter others. Several series of arrests also wiped out the student resistance network that Georges and Mai Politzer had set up. Mai herself was languishing in a prison cell when she lost the two most important men in her life, her husband, Georges, and her brother-at-arms, Jacques Decour, both executed by German firing squads at Mont-Valérien in May 1942. Mai Politzer and Danielle Casanova, the two resistance fighters from the Union of the Young Girls of France, were transferred to the fort of Romainville, whence they would be deported a few weeks later in a convoy of resistors to the camp of Auschwitz-Birkenau. In 1943, they both died there at the camp of typhus. Thousands of women living in France were to fall victim to the barbarism of the Germans and their Vichy accomplices. Having been forced back in 1940 to submit themselves to a census, from the 29th of May 1942, the Jews of the occupied zone now all had to wear a yellow star. In a matter of months, internment camps were created both in the occupied zone and the free zone, at Pithiviers, Beaune-la-Rolande, Drancy, and Rivesaltes. In Paris, there were rumors of an imminent mass roundup. On the 15th and 16th of July 1942, the French police, at the request of the German High Command, arrested 12,884 foreign Jews living in Paris and took them to the Veldiv, the winter velodrome. They were mostly women and children, who, despite the rumor, had not tried to hide. For who would have thought for a moment that there'd be mass arrests of women? And of children, what's more. Between 1942 and 1944, almost all foreign Jews were arrested, as well as 24,000 Jews of French nationality. In total, 76,000 Jews living in France went to the death camps, including 11,400 children under 17. Of all those, hardly 2,500 would survive. Amid the snows of the Soviet winter unfolded the largest theater of military operations the world had ever seen. It was total war, to the death, until one or other of the belligerents, the USSR or Nazi Germany, was wiped out. The two armies would each lose several million soldiers on the field of battle. The Soviet arms factories were running at full steam day and night, thanks to the widespread use of female factory workers. The USSR was the only nation at war to have sent women to the front. Nearly 1 million Soviet women would take up arms to fight the Wehrmacht, either as members of the Red Army or in the ranks of the partisans mobilized from among the civilian population to harry the German troops. The Red Army managed to hold off the German occupiers, and in early 1943, to liberate Stalingrad, at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives, both men and women. It was a dramatic, symbolic, and humiliating defeat for the Wehrmacht. And a turning point in this world war that had now been going on for 4 long years. Sophie Scholl saw her brother Hans go off to fight in Russia. He came back from the Eastern Front a different man, grown up and more determined than ever to fight the Nazis and their endless terror, hate, and death. So brother and sister, along with a few friends, started printing thousands of tracts in a little workshop round the corner. They signed them with the mysterious name of their group, the White Rose. One morning, Sophie and Hans took a suitcase full of White Rose leaflets to the university, threw them from the stairways, and watched them flutter off into the Munich winter. Fellow students, our nation stands shaken before the demise of the men of Stalingrad. The dead of Stalingrad beseech us. Our nation is awakening against the enslavement of Europe by National Socialism in a new pious revival of freedom and honor. The university's concierge saw Sophie and Hans, gathered up the leaflets, and called the Gestapo. Once they'd finished interrogating them for several weeks in the Munich prison, the Gestapo put its own tracts up on the walls of the university. Condemned to death for high treason, Sophie Scholl, 22, Hans Scholl, 25. The sentence has been carried out. Sophie, the heart and soul of the White Rose, and her brother Hans had been guillotined. The Americans, who had by now entered the war as Britain's allies, landed in North Africa and liberated Algiers. Taken by surprise, the Wehrmacht decided to invade the Free Zone and occupy the whole of France. The German army was deployed everywhere, along with its bloodhounds, the Gestapo, who now settled in Lyon under the command of Klaus Barbie. Klaus Barbie had drawn up a blacklist of resistance members to be arrested as a priority. At the top of his list was a woman. Barbie called her the Limping Lady, and she'd become a leading light of the British SOE network in France. It was she who passed on all their intelligence to London. The Limping Lady was none other than Virginia Hall. The Francophile American had been sent to Vichy undercover as a journalist and, based in Lyon, had put together a far-reaching network of spies. But Barbie got there too late. By the time the Free Zone was invaded, Virginia had managed to get herself to the American embassy in Madrid. But she was not one to give up easily. And in 1944, she would come back to France as a member of the American Secret Service to join the underground resistance at Chambon-sur-Lignon. She would go on to join the CIA. Now the whole of France was German. By staying put with the occupiers instead of joining the Allies in Algiers, Marshal Pétain's government had shown which side it was really on. The masks were off. Pierre Laval, the head of government, announced that he'd prefer the Germans to win the war and not the Russian Bolsheviks. Marshal Pétain tried to put a good face on things, playing more than ever the role of father of the nation. A father, after all, never betrays his children. So to cover up the awful truth of its collaboration with the Nazis, Vichy's propaganda started endlessly showing the old marshal with his children, or with young women, or at schools. And when Laval's government, at the request of the Germans, installed the compulsory work service, a program of compulsory labor to bolster Germany's workforce, once again, it was the women who became the tools of propaganda. The men should go off and work in Germany if they valued their family's well-being, while the women had to just put up with losing a husband or a son. What better way to sell the politics of collaboration than through the image of a mother and her child? But women were seeing their men leave not for Germany, but for the underground resistance. And they themselves were the first to keep them in supplies. A force of nurture, without whom none of it would have been possible. It was getting as urgent for Laval to catch these fugitives from the work program as to catch the resistors. He had to have more police, more security checks. So on behalf of Marshal Pétain, he created a paramilitary force, the Milice Française, to hunt down the enemy within. Several thousand French women chose to enlist in this anti-republican, anti-Semitic, anti-communist, nationalist movement. A deadly darkness was swallowing both the country and its honor. Under the Germans, the Paris night belonged to the so-called countesses of the Gestapo as they whirled through the blizzard of parties on the arms of their German officers. There were French, both men and women, eager to be part of this feast of the Reich, this squandering of all France's riches. Most of it was paid for by goods and property stolen from the Jews, whom people were denouncing to get their hands on their apartments, their furs, their jewels. But the Nazis went first for the works of art, which they hoarded at the Louvre, then at the Jeu de Paume. Thanks to the courage of Rose Valland, who worked at the Jeux de Paume Museum, we know just which masterpieces were taken and packed off to Germany, cherry-picked by Nazi dignitaries such as Marshal Goering, who made a special trip to Paris to pick up a few canvases stolen from collectors. In a matter of months, the German Gestapo, along with the French militia, would wipe out the French interior resistance, which was then uniting around Jean Moulin, who'd been sent by de Gaulle to set up a resistance army. This is the last photo of Bertie Albrecht, the leading light along with Henri Faunet of the combat movement. She'd been arrested a few times, and only weeks previously had managed to escape, only to once again be betrayed in Mâcon in May 1943. She couldn't bear to be incarcerated again, or to risk betraying her comrades, so she hanged herself in her prison cell at Fresnes. Her body was thrown into the prison's communal grave. Lucie Aubrac's secret life took a turn for the worse when Raymond was arrested along with Jean Moulin and other resistance leaders at Caluire in June 43. At Caluire, and then in the weeks that followed across the land, the Gestapo dealt the resistance a terrible blow. Lucie Aubrac couldn't stand it that her man had fallen into the hands of Klaus Barbie. She was an expert at breaking resistance fighters out of jail. She was the head of the action wing of her network, charged with the most difficult missions. She succeeded 4 months later, while pregnant with her second child, in freeing Raymond by means of a commando attack by her group. Winston Churchill had told the SOE to, in each and every territory occupied by the Nazis, set Europe ablaze. In France, that was the mission of hundreds of male agents, but also of 39 very special female ones, all trained in weapons handling and sabotage, and taught to endure torture before being sent into the field. Each of them was charged with setting up and maintaining a resistance network in France. It was a war of intelligence, the price for which would be these spies' lives, sacrificed on the altar of reason of state. The final destination of these women, who according to Nazi rules had to wear the red triangle, was the women's camp at Ravensbrück, north of Berlin. Either there, or the women's quarters of other camps, Bergen-Belsen, Mauthausen, or Auschwitz-Birkenau. Geneviève de Gaulle was deported to Ravensbrück in January 1944.
L'univers concentrationnaire, ça a été une affreuse découverte. On n'avait pas imaginé que c'était un système à détruire l'homme. Alors j'ai vu les visages de certaines de ces femmes et ça m'avait absolument bouleversée. J'ai commencé à entrevoir qu'on allait peut-être essayer de détruire en nous quelque chose qui nous était beaucoup plus précieux que la vie, qui était notre valeur profonde, notre dignité profonde. On avait quand même quelque chose de très précieux, je veux dire, nous qui étions arrêtés pour résistance, c'est que nous savions pourquoi. Ça avait un sens déjà. Pensez à ces hommes ou à ces femmes qui ont été mis dans ces conditions atroces comme ça, parce qu'ils étaient juifs ou parce qu'ils étaient tziganes ou parce que n'importe quoi.
Geneviève de Gaulle was liberated by the Red Army, which took over the Ravensbrück camp on the 25th of April 1945. Of the 10,000 women deported to the camp, only 2,000 were to come back alive. British and American troops landed in France in June 1944, after which the country was progressively liberated. The French were partying with the Allies, celebrating their new freedom and the hope of peace at last. Those smiles, though, hid all the pain and the courage of the women, over which a veil would soon be drawn. And while those dark years had forced women to face their daily challenges alone, the return of the prisoners of war would only increase their marital problems. How could you rebuild a family after so many years of separation? How could each understand all the other's suffering? In the months following the war's end, there were a lot of divorces. Worse still, with the ensuing purge that came to punish those who'd collaborated with the enemy, women would become the scapegoats of the inevitable popular vengeance, led by men. The humiliation inflicted with appalling violence on these women, who were often from the bottom of the social ladder, was a great injustice, seeing as so many of those who had politically sympathized with the Germans or profited by the occupation were spared. It was as if sexual relations were the ultimate crime for a woman. Shaving their heads symbolized to everyone the innate irresponsibility of womankind. Women, the eternal victims of war, in defeat as in victory. Thousands of French women were raped by the American liberators. Tens of thousands of German women were raped by the Red Army, as if taking it out on the women enabled the men to get over their own anguish. It is as well then never to forget that during the dark night of the occupation, many women in France chose to go undercover and to resist. There were many of them, but their deeds would long be underestimated and unrecognized by the men whose idea of resistance glorified only military action. As for the women themselves, they had no real desire to go down in history as heroines of the liberation, preferring simply to turn the page on a chapter that was redolent only of the odor of death. Yet it is thanks to their courage and their patriotism that first the National Resistance Council, then the Advisory Council in Algiers, proposed and adopted into law the right to vote of all French women, enacted by order of General de Gaulle in October 1944. And how many people know that it was a woman who wrote the song that became the symbol of the French resistance? It was Anna Marly who conceived this hymn to resistance based on Joseph Kessel's lyrics. Let us never forget this woman who composed one of the most famous tunes in the history of France.
Ici, nous vois-tu, nous on marche et on nous tue, et où on crève. Ici, chacun sait ce qu'il veut, ce qu'il fait quand il passe. Ami, si tu tombes, un ami sort de l'ombre à ta place. Demain, du sang noir séchera au grand soleil sur la route. Chantez, compagnons, dans la nuit, la liberté nous écoute. Oh, oh.